In 1893, in Chicago, a city of impossible white palaces appeared overnight. Grand colonnades, soaring domes, lagoons and fountains lit by 100,000 electric lights, in a country where most people still read by oil lamp. 14 million people walked through it. Then, within months of closing, almost every building was gone, burned, demolished, erased. The official story says it was all made of plaster, a temporary illusion, built cheap and torn down fast. But the photographs tell a different story, and tonight we're going to look at what the photographs actually show, and ask who decided that all of it had to disappear. Let us set the scene clearly, because the scale of what we are talking about matters. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago covered over 600 acres of land on the south shore of Lake Michigan. It contained more than 200 buildings. Its central court of honor, nicknamed the White City, was lined with neoclassical structures of extraordinary scale and refinement, columned facades, ornate pediments, vaulted interior halls, and a central basin large enough to require a fleet of gondolas. The entire complex was served by an electric railway. It was lit, after dark, by arc lamps and incandescent lights in numbers that no city in the world had yet deployed in its streets. The official documentation states that this complex was designed and built in approximately 2 years, between 1891 and 1893, on land that had previously been a swamp. 2 years on a swamp. 200 buildings, by hand, with horses, in a pre-crane era. The same pattern holds for the Paris Exposition of 1900, which covered over 500 acres and included structures whose architectural detail rivals anything in the permanent buildings of the French capital, and for the Pan-American Exposition of 1901 in Buffalo, and for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 in St. Louis, which was, at the time, the largest World's Fair ever held. Each one appeared, each one astonished, and then, with remarkable consistency, each one was gone, demolished, burned, or simply removed, leaving almost nothing behind. The speed of construction and the totality of the destruction are two facts that, taken together, demand a serious explanation. The standard explanation for how the World's Fair buildings were constructed so quickly is a material called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and natural fibre, primarily hemp or jute. Staff could be cast into moulds and produced in large quantities, allowing ornate architectural detail to be manufactured rather than carved. It was used extensively in theatrical set construction and exhibition work throughout the 19th century. This explanation is real. Staff was used at the World's Fairs. That part of the official record is not disputed. But staff has physical limitations that photographs of the fair buildings consistently contradict. Staff is not load-bearing at significant scale. It cannot support the weight of a multi-story facade without an internal structural frame that would be both visible and documented. Staff weathers rapidly under exposure to rain and temperature variation. Within a single season of Chicago weather, unprotected staff surfaces show significant deterioration. And staff cannot reproduce the depth of shadow in carved detail that high-resolution photographs of the fair buildings clearly show. A plaster cast of an acanthus capital looks like a plaster cast. The capitals in the fair photographs cast shadows like stone. Several engineers and architectural historians who have examined the highest resolution surviving photographs of the 1893 exposition have noted, in terms ranging from cautious to direct, that what they see in those images is not consistent with staff construction. The surface texture, the structural behavior of the facades in wind-loading conditions visible in some photographs, and the dimensional consistency of the ornamental detail are all more consistent with cut stone or high-quality cast concrete than with the material the official record describes. The buildings looked like stone. The official story says they were not. The photographs suggest the official story is worth questioning. Let us talk about the lights, because this is where the physical impossibility of the official account becomes most direct. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 was illuminated by approximately 100,000 electric lights. This figure appears in the fair's own promotional materials and is not disputed. The effect, described by every contemporary account, was transformative. Visitors who had never seen electric light on any scale found the illuminated fairgrounds so extraordinary that many wept. The night displays became one of the fair's primary attractions. Now let us consider the context. Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station, the first commercial electrical power plant in the United States, had opened in Lower Manhattan in 1882, 11 years earlier. By 1893, electrical service existed in parts of several American cities, supplied by small, local generating stations. But the total electrical generating capacity of the entire city of Chicago in 1893 was a fraction of what would have been required to power 100,000 lights across 600 acres. The fair built its own power plant. This is documented. The machinery hall contained large generating equipment. But the scale of the documented equipment does not match the scale of the documented illumination. Engineers who have modelled the power requirements of the 1893 fair against the documented generating capacity have consistently found a gap that the official record does not close. Nikola Tesla demonstrated his alternating current system at the fair. This is historically confirmed. His relationship with the fair's power supply is real. But Tesla was also, at this precise moment in his career, working on wireless energy transmission. And some researchers have proposed that what was demonstrated at Chicago in 1893 was not merely a preview of the electrical future, but a final public display of an electrical system whose infrastructure already existed and was about to be replaced. This part of the World's Fair story is one that mainstream history does acknowledge, but tends to treat as an embarrassing footnote rather than a central feature of what these events were for. At the Chicago Exposition of 1893, and at virtually every major World's Fair held between 1870 and 1930, living human beings were put on display. People from colonized territories in Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas were brought to the fairgrounds and exhibited in constructed native villages, enclosures designed to represent their home environments, in which they were expected to perform daily activities for the entertainment of paying visitors. These exhibitions were called ethnological displays. They were endorsed by the leading anthropologists of the day. They were enormously popular. At the 1904 St. Louis Fair, Ota Benga, a man from what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, was exhibited alongside primates in the anthropology section. He was later displayed at the Bronx Zoo in New York. This happened in living memory of people whose grandchildren are still alive. The human displays served a specific narrative function. They established for enormous popular audiences a hierarchy of civilization. At the bottom were the primitive peoples in their enclosures. At the top was the dazzling technology of the White City, electricity, machinery, architecture, presented as the exclusive achievement of the civilization hosting the fair. The implication was direct and was intended to be. This is where humanity came from, and this, right here in these gleaming buildings, is where it has arrived. Progress, advancement, the march of civilization. What the exhibits could not afford to suggest was the possibility that the people in the enclosures had once been part of something as sophisticated as the buildings surrounding them. That question was never put to the crowds. It was not on the program. The technology exhibited at the world's fairs consistently exceeded what the documented industrial base of the period could plausibly have produced. And this excess has been noted quietly by historians of technology for decades. At the 1893 Chicago Fair, an electric elevated railway transported visitors around the fairgrounds. Fully automatic, running on a fixed schedule, it was described by engineering press of the time as the most sophisticated transit system in operation anywhere in the world. Its control systems, the mechanisms that regulated its speed, spacing, and switching, were more advanced than anything in commercial service in any city at the time. Within a few years of the fair's closure, the technology was apparently not developed further. No commercial system based on it was built. The hydraulic systems that supplied the fair's artificial lagoons and fountains moved volumes of water at pressures and flow rates that required pump technology of exceptional sophistication. Contemporary engineering accounts describe the pumping plant in terms of admiration. But the specific designs used were not subsequently adopted in municipal water systems, which continued to use simpler, older technology. And throughout the machinery halls of multiple fairs, visitors encountered operating equipment whose function contemporary observers could not fully explain. Devices that produced effects, electrical, mechanical, acoustic, that the exhibitors described in general terms, without providing technical specifications that could be independently evaluated. The standard interpretation is that these were demonstration models, prototypes of technologies that were too expensive or too complex for immediate commercial deployment. This is possible, but prototypes are typically preserved, studied, and developed. The fair machinery was dismantled and its fate not documented. What became of the most sophisticated technology of the Gilded Age, exhibited before millions of people and then simply removed from the record, is a question the history of technology has never satisfactorily answered. At the 1893 Chicago Fair, the entertainment district, known as the Midway Plaisance, was a mile-long corridor running perpendicular to the main fairground axis. At its center stood the first Ferris wheel ever built, a structure 264 feet in diameter, capable of carrying more than 2,000 passengers simultaneously, built from 3,500 tons of steel by an engineer named George Washington Gale Ferris, Jr. Ferris had approximately 18 months to design, fabricate, and erect this structure from scratch in 1892. With no computer modeling, no finite element analysis, no precedent to draw from. The engineering involved was, by the consensus of structural engineers who have studied it, extraordinary. Not impossible, but at the absolute outer boundary of what the documented technology of the period should have allowed. And the wheel worked perfectly. On its first operation with a full load. No structural failures. No significant modifications required after the initial tests. Now consider the geometry of the fair as a whole. The principal axis of the White City, the main ceremonial corridor running from the entrance to the central basin, is oriented to align with the midsummer sunrise at the latitude of Chicago. The layout of the primary buildings around the central court of honor follows proportions consistent with the golden ratio. The Midway Plaisance, running at 90 degrees to the main axis, points true east-west. These are not the planning decisions of a team working rapidly on a swampy lakefront under time pressure. These are the decisions of designers working from a sophisticated formal tradition that understood astronomical alignment and sacred geometry. The same tradition that appears again and again in the permanent architecture of every civilization we have examined in this series. Someone who knew the old language was designing the World's Fair. The question is what they were trying to say with it. Here is the pattern. Learn it and then decide for yourself how much weight to give it. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 closed in October. By January of 1894, the casino, the manufacturers building, and several other major structures had burned in a fire attributed to vagrants sheltering in the abandoned complex. The remaining buildings were subsequently demolished. The Pan American Exposition of 1901 in Buffalo closed in November. The buildings were demolished over the following year. No significant structures survived. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904 in St. Louis, the largest fair ever held, closed in December. The buildings were demolished. The site became Forest Park, which remains a public green space. No fair buildings survive. The Panama Pacific International Exposition of 1915 in San Francisco closed in December. The buildings were demolished. One structure, the Palace of Fine Arts, was saved by popular petition. When examined closely, the Palace of Fine Arts turns out to be built from concrete of a quality and aggregate composition that does not match the staff and plaster description applied to its sister buildings. It looks and behaves structurally like a permanent masonry building. Which raises the obvious question. If the other buildings were also permanent masonry, if they were stone or high-quality concrete rather than staff, then their demolition was not the clearing of temporary structures. It was the deliberate destruction of permanent architecture. And the fires that preceded the demolitions at Chicago were not an accident of abandoned buildings and winter squatters. They were, if this interpretation holds, the first phase of a removal operation. Clear the public first with fire, then finish the job with dynamite and salvage crews, and make sure the plans don't survive. Among the most disturbing exhibits at multiple World's Fairs, and among the least discussed in popular histories of these events, were the infant incubator displays. Beginning at the 1896 Berlin Exposition and continuing through fairs in London, Omaha, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco, a showman named Martin Cooney operated exhibits in which premature infants were placed in glass-fronted mechanical incubators and displayed to paying visitors. The babies were real. They were live. Visitors paid admission to watch them breathe. Cooney's stated mission was to demonstrate and promote infant incubator technology, which was genuinely new in the 1890s and was meeting resistance from the medical establishment. He positioned the exhibits as a combination of medical demonstration and charitable fundraising. And there is a real documented history of premature infants whose lives were saved by Cooney's incubators, at a time when hospitals would not use them. But the exhibit format, live human infants on public display in a commercial entertainment context at a world exposition, raises questions that the charitable framing does not fully resolve. Where did the babies come from? Their parents, in some cases, are documented. In others, the provenance is vague. In the broader context of the World's Fairs, with their human zoos, their orphan populations, their deliberate construction of a new social order, the incubator displays look less like medical altruism and more like another aspect of the same program, the management of human populations in a period of profound, deliberate social reorganization. A generation of children born in uncertain circumstances, raised in the institutions of a new order, with no memory of the world that existed before the fairs. The incubators were just the most visible part of that process. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco is not the only structure from the World's Fair era that survives in a form that contradicts the official story of temporary plaster construction. It is simply the most prominent. In St. Louis, the buildings that became the permanent campus of Washington University, originally constructed for the 1904 fair, are still standing. Their stonework is solid, their foundations deep, their architectural detail precise. They do not look like buildings that were assembled in 2 years as temporary exhibition structures. They look like what they are: permanent, high-quality, institutional architecture. In Chicago, several structures associated with the fair's supporting infrastructure survived into the 20th century and were only demolished as part of subsequent urban development. Their demolition records describe masonry of unusual quality, concrete of a type not consistent with standard 1890s construction practice. And then there is the Eiffel Tower. Built for the Paris Exposition of 1889, it was officially designated as a temporary structure, intended to be demolished after 20 years. It was saved, ultimately, because it proved useful as a radio transmission antenna. Its creator, Gustave Eiffel, was an engineer of extraordinary capability, whose other works, bridges, railway stations, the internal armature of the Statue of Liberty, are among the finest structural engineering of any era. The tower's proportions, its specific height of 300 meters, its placement on the Paris axis, and its documented use as a wireless transmission tower connect it directly to the themes of atmospheric energy and signal transmission that we have traced throughout this series. It was called temporary. It was preserved because it worked. And what it was working as, in 1889, before Marconi's radio, before Tesla's tower, is a question that the official record of the exposition does not address. We have arrived at the conclusion of our investigation into the world's fairs. And the conclusion is this: whatever these events were, they were not what we were taught they were. They were not celebrations of new achievement. The technology on display was too sophisticated, assembled too quickly, and removed too thoroughly to have been the product of the civilization hosting the events. The buildings were too grand, too permanent in their physical behavior, and too systematically demolished to have been the temporary plaster constructions the official record describes. The world's fairs were, we believe the evidence suggests, something else entirely. They were a transition ceremony, a handover. The point at which the infrastructure, the technology, and the built environment of a prior civilization, call it Tartaria, call it the Old World, call it whatever name you find least uncomfortable, was displayed one final time, catalogued by the new order that had inherited it, stripped of anything useful, and then destroyed. The human exhibits served to establish the new civilization's legitimacy by contrast. Look at the primitive peoples in their enclosures, and then look at these magnificent buildings. This is what we built. This is what we achieved. Forget that you do not know how we built it. Forget that the records are missing. Forget that the plans burned. Just look at the lights. And then, when the crowds went home, they burned it all down. Not because it was temporary, because it was evidence. The Crystal Palace in London, the White City in Chicago,
the palaces of Paris and St. Louis and San Francisco, all of them gone. All of them removed with a thoroughness that permanent structures are never removed with, unless the people doing the removing have a very specific reason to make sure that nothing remains. The old world had its funeral at the world's fairs. We just were not told that we were attending one.